Hi everyone, and welcome to my guide for the Nova Necromancer in Season 27. This is one of the best builds in the game now, thanks to the buffs to the Funerary Pick and the Iron Rose. And along with that came also a buff to the trag'oul set, which was one of the worst sets in the game, traditionally played with Corpse Lance or Corpse Explosion. So now this is a Nova build, and it is really strong. It can go all the way to GR 150 in solo, and it's even strong enough to be part of the 4-man meta as a trash killer, all the way to a GR 150 as well. So this is one of the top 3 trash killers in the game, along with the Meteor Wizard and the LOD Hoda Barbarian, but this is only on seasonal. So it's very likely that Nova will stay near the top in groups at the very least. But even in solo, we have ranked it in S tier with trag'ouls and another version that uses the Legacy of Dreams. And there's even a third version using the Inario set, which is quite comparable as well. It has very similar damage to trag'ouls, but it's mostly has a downside of being more squishy. So it is ranked a little below. But overall, those 3 variations are all really good, and you can push to the highest tiers with it. The good part about this build is it's fairly simple. So the main gameplay loop here is that you channel with siphon blood from your enemies, and as you do that, you release these Novas automatically, and so do your simulacrums. So you have to try to position them in a good spot in the middle of a pack, and then you channel away and you will deal damage around you automatically. It's pretty straightforward and not really that much that can go wrong. With trag'ouls in particular, you're also quite tanky. This build got a significant toughness boost along with the damage bonus, and you have lots of healing, and as long as you don't get one-shot, you'll most likely survive pretty much anything. Now that being said, while the build is very powerful and can push all the way, it doesn't do so very easily because it has extremely low single target damage. So there were some efforts to try to improve that with the Funerary Pick, as you have seen in the intro, but the Blood-type Blade mechanic makes it so that you scale up your AoE damage tremendously in large monster density. So this was capped in this patch to kind of streamline the damage down a little bit between big AoE and single target, but it still has a significant weakness at single targets, in particular bosses. So for example, when you try to push extremely high of this at like GR 140 plus or so, you can channel away at the boss for minutes and minutes and you will not kill it, simply because you don't have extra targets most of the time. So the typical strategy to achieve a successful high-end solo push with this build is to save a pylon or 2 or even 3, to then use Nemesis Bracers to spawn extra targets, which scales up your damage from the Blood-type Blade. So you stack Bane of Stricken for a minute or 2, then you click the pylons, and then you kill the boss in like another minute or 2. So this is kind of the ideal scenario on a high-end push. You don't really have to worry about this when you're just farming lower tiers, like if you go to maybe up to 110, 115 or so, there's not really that much issue, but this is kind of where the build starts slowing down on single target noticeably. And you can't really improve the tiers very much without having extremely long boss fights. Most bosses are single target, and without those extra targets that come from the Nemesis Bracers, you just take way too long. But as you can see here with this background footage so far, I've been doing a GR 125 here. This was, I think, on the first day of the PTR actually. So it was not exactly the final version of the build that you see in this footage, because I mostly played it in groups later on with other people playing the Necromancer. But you see its power, you see that I was able to survive this just fine. It is fairly tanky, and yeah, the build just works pretty well. Later in the PTR, when I was better geared up and I had some gem levels and some paragons, as you can see here, I was also trying this out in some speedruns on higher tiers. So this is 112 here right now, for example. And it worked much better. So you can make it work, you can farm with this, but especially Rathma Necromancer is going to be the build of choice. I've already made a guide for that. It is going to be the best solo farming build for Necromancers. And it also pairs well with this Nova in groups, where Rathma can kill the boss while Nova is the trash killer. So you can actually run a double Necromancer combo next time around. So with all this out of the way, let's jump into the setup here. So I have a total of 3 different planners, and they're all very similar. And I've also written the Nova guide. So I've rewrote the entire LOD Nova guide that we already had on Maxroll, and then I use that as a baseline to make the trag'oul, Nova, and the Inarius Nova guides, so they're all fairly similar. Once you understand the core concept and the core mechanics, it's almost interchangeable with the sets. So we have the funerary pick. I already showed this. We do 200% extra damage after using Siphon Blood with Power Shift, and you get an extra 300% damage bonus against the target that you siphon from, or double that bonus, so 600% bonus against a single target. So this was done to try to improve the single target damage, and it does work to some degree, but at least on the last version of the PTR, there was a bug that this extra bonus didn't apply to the simulacrums. So only like 1/3 of the damage was buffed, because you do 1/3 and then you have to do simulacrums casting the Novas, and they were not buffed. So I reported this to the devs. This might or might not be fixed. We don't actually know about this yet. I will have a pinned comment about this. The second core item here is the Iron Rose. This one gives you a huge damage buff for your Nova, up to 500%, as long as they have lost some life in the past minute. This is basically always the case, so you don't have to worry much about this, but for example, when you click a shield pylon, you don't lose life from at least enemy attacks, and you have to try to lose life another way, or not click shield pylons, at least in the case of trag'oul Necromancer. The thing about trag'oul set is that the 2-piece bonus gives you all runes on Blood Rush, and one of that is removing the life cost of the skill. So on a trag'oul set, you actually cannot lose life even with a shield pylon by blood rushing, while on LOD and Inarius you can. So this is something to keep in mind. In addition to this damage effect, the Iron Rose is also responsible for triggering those automatic death novas. So this is what you see here all the time. As long as you siphon blood, you will trigger. And there is one thing to note here, and that is that your simulacrums can proc area damage with that, but your own automatic novas do not proc area damage. So this makes the simulacrums particularly powerful in AoE scenarios, and you have 2 of them, so they do basically all of your damage in big packs, and then only when there's like very few monsters you actually contribute a lot more, especially with this funerary pick bug that I described earlier. So as the number of targets decreases, your own damage goes up and your simulacrum damage kind of goes down, at least like their total share of the damage done. Lastly, we got the third key item here, which is the Blood-Tide Blade. This one was nearly unchanged, but it got nerfed with a cap of up to 25 targets now. So previously this was uncapped, which made this single target versus AoE difference even larger. And now this is kind of like, brought back in line a little bit. And yeah, it was a slight nerf to the item, but overall not really the biggest deal. And most of the time you would just evaporate all the small trash, for example, with like your first Nova. So you had like 1 or 2 big casts or triggers, and then you would have not really much more than 25 targets anyway, even on a previously pretty large pool. But what this means is that, for example, when you're pushing and also in Foreman, you generally want to have 25 targets, because then you're playing the build at its full potential. So you try to go for large pulls wherever possible to try to maximize this damage bonus, and this is massive. And this is also the reason why I was talking about those Nemesis bracers earlier. When you try to kill a boss in a solo push, for example, you need to use this Blood-Tide Blade effect to scale up your damage with multiple targets. And if the boss doesn't have any adds, if it's not like a Hamelin or a Saxtress or something like that, then this bonus is extremely small and you will take forever to kill the boss, even with this Funerary Pick single target buff. So the idea is to combine the two so that you can use, first of all, Banish's Stricken stacks to scale up your damage, and then the Funerary Pick with the extra single target bonus and the Blood-Tide Blade on top of it. So you want to try to siphon exactly from the target that is like your main nuke target. For example, an elite in the pull, or the boss, or even when there's Nemesis bracers adds around. One other important item is the Haunted Visions. Because this build relies on simulacrums, you need to have this amulet for this to really function, because this makes your simulacrums last forever. Without this amulet, they're just gonna disappear after 10 seconds, and you have like a 2-minute cooldown, so you're gonna lose out on a lot of your damage. You need to have this amulet. The rest of the gear is pretty straightforward, so we have the full set here. We have the Chris bins, so this is always included in Necromancer builds. We have a Convention of Elements, it's also not a surprise, I guess. Ring of Grandeur and a cube to combine trag'oul and the Guardian set here, so this is the low Paragon version. This is actually a build where the Guardian set fits pretty well. There's also a high Paragon version where you can go with all guilds, so later on you're gonna swap this if you play the season long enough. And for example, in groups you kind of want to go with all guilds anyway, because you don't really need the extra like toughness that you gain from the Guardian set. So it gives you a lot of vitality, a lot of strength, but quite early on the all guilds will be better, at least in scenarios where you don't care about toughness, which is usually the case in groups. And also we have the Mantle of Channeling, which just gives you extra damage and damage reduction while channeling, so this applies with Siphon Blood. And we have Dainty's Binding for 50% damage reduction from the curse, which usually comes from the Aura of Frailty, so you don't have to do anything for that, besides just standing next to enemies. Our skill setup is as follows. So our main skill is the Death Nova Blood Nova rune. This one deals the most damage, and it also spends life, which is a requirement for the trag'oul set. But even without that, for example on the LOD version and on the Inarius version, you still play the same rune. The thing about this item is that this Death Nova is only triggered for yourself, but not for your simulacrums if you don't have Death Nova on the bar. So we don't actually press the button, we just siphon blood all the time to trigger those Novas, but you need to have it on the bar for your simulacrums, so that they also benefit from the higher base damage of the rune compared to no rune, for example. And also in the case of trag'ouls, you need to have this life spending ability to even get the damage from the set bonus. Then we have the Siphon Blood, so this one gives you a lot of healing, and you also gain all the runes in the trag'oul set, so you don't actually have to choose a rune. But in the case of LOD or Inarius, you have to use Power Shift here. This one is the trigger for the funerary pick. So without choosing this rune, you're not going to get the bonus. Then we have the Simulacrum. We have the Blood and Bone rune, so this one spawns 2 of those guys, and this means you just get double the bonus from the extra Novas, so you always want to use that rune. And there is one thing to watch out for here, and this is that those Simulacrums can actually die. So I talked about the Haunted Visions, but this one only prevents them from expiring, but not from dying. So they can actually die to monster damage, for example, big bursts of monster damage, such as grotesque explosions, molten explosions, this kind of stuff. If it comes in really quickly, it can just rip them apart, and you're going to be left with a 2-minute cooldown with no simulacrums. So one way around this is, first of all, that you always pay attention to what's actually around you, what you're actually fighting. So those examples I mentioned are very important in particular. So the grotesques and the moltens, those are like those really big explosions. You can blood rush away, and your simulacrums are not going to be safe. Always keep an eye out on the positioning. They usually don't die from like random monster attacks or something like this. Only those really big bursts, and they also heal up fairly fast. It's kind of unknown how exactly their healing works, but they also do scale with your toughness. And there are various ways to increase your toughness just through gameplay alone with both the trag'ouls and the LOD set. So you can actually snapshot higher toughness into your simulacrums to make them way tankier. In the case of trag'oul set, you have the 4-piece bonus that gives you up to 300% extra life when you heal while at full life already. So what you want to do is, at least in a push scenario or in a 4-man, at the start of the run, you try to stack up this bonus first from, for example, Siphon Blood, and then you cast your simulacrums after like a few seconds with the higher life pool. And this higher life pool will apply to the simulacrums at all times. Similarly, in LOD, you can do this with Stone Gauntlets. So there's no maximum life pool here, but we have Stone Gauntlets. And again, you can just walk into the first pack of monsters, get a few hits, and then you cast your simulacrums with the higher armor bonus snapshotted into them. Inarius doesn't really have such a mechanic aside from the esoteric alteration, so technically could do something similar here by dropping your life below 50% HP and then profiting from this extra all res that also applies to simulacrums. So those are the 3 options to improve the survivability and make them die a bit less. But generally, this is only a problem with those really big bursts, as I mentioned. Next skill is our Blood Rush. So this is just for mobility, to position yourself, use Oculus rings, etc. So just really nice in every way. Then we have the curse here, so we have Aura of Frailty. This is just auto-applied around you to proc the dainty and also just to kill enemies more quickly. It's very helpful. You can replace this with a defensive curse if you want. For example, Decrepify Wither gives you 40% damage reduction. So if you ever feel too squishy, this is an option, but you have to cast it manually then. So you have to actually like use it on enemies. You can also do this, for example, in groups. If your group is like too squishy in general, people are dying, you can just swap the curse there. That's quite helpful. Or also you can use Early Grave. So instead of auto-applying it around you, there's a rune where enemies die at 18% HP already, which is also really nice in Foreman play. And lastly, you have the Bone Armor, gives us 30% damage reduction and allows us to stun enemies. So this is helpful for the Crispin uptime. While stunning, for example, on the Convention of Elements rotation, you deal double DPS through the Crispin, and you want to use this during your nuke phases. The passives are pretty straightforward, so one important here is the Swift Harvesting. The reason why we have the Swift Harvesting passive is because it gives us a nice breakpoint for Siphon Blood, which then triggers Iron Rose at the optimal rate. So that breakpoint you're trying to hit is 1.67 APS in your character details, so when you open your sheet. And this is quite easily achieved because the base attacks per second is already 1.3 on the Fury pick, and you get 10% from Paragons. And then you need usually 3 other sources of attack speed. So in case of solo push, you can use the Enchantress for 6% and then 2 item rolls, and this will be more than fine. The other passives here are mostly just for extra damage and extra survivability. So we have Spelling Malediction. This one gives you extra damage from your curse. You have Standalone, 100% armor is very useful. And the Simulacrums don't count for this negative effect. So you get a full value here. And we have the Final Service that just prevents you from dying. For our gems, we have the Bane of the Trap. This is included in every single variation of the build. We have the Bane of the Stricken, at least in solo push. This is needed to kill the boss in any kind of reasonable time frame. And you see here is an Invigorating Gemstone. So this is kind of like an optional choice. And it's just like nice to have because you don't get CC'd, you don't get knocked around, you don't get repositioned from feared or something like that. So you can use a more offensive choice if you like Bane of the Powerful or Zaze. Even though this is like more like a melee build, Zaze still provides a little bit of damage. And this is actually used in some other variants here. But at least early on, I can recommend this gem because it just makes your life way easier. Later on, you definitely want to swap this out for like the highest pushes. And you want to go for all the damage you can. So this would be, for example, the Zaze. In speed farming, we have like the Zaze and the Bane of the Powerful combo. And the same also applies to group play, for example. But if you feel too squishy, then you could replace one of these two. Both of them are not very powerful offensive choices here. And if you ever feel like you need more toughness, you can go with like an Esoteric Alteration, for example. In fact, in case of Inarius, because the toughness is way lower on this build, I actually have included Esoteric Alteration in pretty much all the setups besides like speed farming, I believe. So here we also have like the same combo with Powerful and Zaze because usually should be fine there. But at least for a push, we have lower toughness than the trag'ouls and you also have less recovery. So I have like multiple times less recovery. So I feel like an extra toughness choice is needed. In addition to the Wisdom of Kalan, which is like core Inarius synergy item, giving you ×4 your toughness. So if you ever play Inarius, you need to have this thing here. More realistic though is that you're most likely going to try out the LOD version at some point. This one, at least for the groups, is probably going to be used more on the higher end once you acquire the gear for it. The reason for that is that it's simply like a little bit more damage. So it's not like extraordinarily more than trag'ouls, but it does have some small advantages like the Blackthorn's Pants, for example, that gives you extra elemental damage. The Stone of Jordan here is included. You don't need to make it for a Granger in the setup, for example. So there's these various small perks, and it ends up kind of on a similar level, a little bit squishier and most likely a little bit more damage. Another advantage of LOD setup is also that you have illusory boots, so you can more easily just walk around through the pools without having to blood rush all the time. You can more easily prepare an Oculus ring and walk in there before like actually doing the big nuke in a group, for example. So there are these little things that add up here, but trag'oul works just fine. One other advantage of LOD is also that the solo speeds variation is just like way better in my opinion, because you can more easily include various benefits. For example, the Steward's Greaves. So you have Steward's Greaves and all the damage combo while having pretty good toughness. You can still have the Stone Gauntlets and even the Brig's Wrath. So you can like run around and pull enemies to you with the Aura of Frailty automatically and then just decimate them with Nova cast. So this actually feels pretty awesome. Now, one last thing before you're asking about the Scythe of the Cycle, which was usually played with Nova builds in the past, because the Fury pick didn't exist in its current form, and this was the weapon of choice here, which buffs the Nova by 400% extra damage. So this is actually a higher value than the Fury pick, which effectively gives you a 200% damage bonus from the power shift effect. But the Fury pick also massively improves the single target damage, especially in the case that this Simulacrum Fury interaction gets fixed, which right now we don't have confirmation for. But also this Cypher Cycle effect lowers the duration of your bone armor, and once your bone armor expires, which happens pretty fast with the amount of Novas you're casting all the time, you actually don't have any damage bonus anymore. So this is the main reason why Cypher Cycle is not used. Theoretically, it does lead to bigger nukes if you play this like as a non-channeling version, basically, just like auto casting, but you do way fewer Novas, and at some point you're gonna run out of the bone armor, and you have to like constantly reapply the bone armor, and you don't have usually enough cooldown to do that consistently. And this also concludes the guide. So it actually turned out way longer than I thought it would, because it's a fairly simple build on the surface, but there are all these little details that at least you should be aware about when you're putting it together, like the attack speed breakpoint and the simulacrums dying and the single target damage that I wanted to explain in detail about this. So yeah, I hope you got all the info that you needed. If you want to see more, then go check out the defeat planners in the description. I also linked all the guides there for the Maxroll version of all those 3 different setups. So if you want to read up on any of those details, you can see them there. Other than this, I hope you have a wonderful start in Season 27. I believe the new Nova Necro is actually pretty cool, and I can't wait to play it myself once I have geared my own Necromancer. So hope you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more defeat content, and I'll see you guys next time.